Does anyone have any questions before we get started? This program, okay, I'm waiting for it to give me the thing. It's gone live. Russ Delaney, N4RTD, will be doing some editing for us, adding some titles and so forth. So that's going to turn out really nice for the recordings. It's really going to turn out nice. I'm going to bring up your presentation. And okay, hang on here a second. And we are now. Okay. All right, now let me minimize this. And I'm going to go ahead and share your screen. And share. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now. It's 9 o'clock. Our first presentation, you see it before you. And an introduction to NXDN Amateur Radio by Paul Toth, NV9X. And take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Darrell, and our condolences on the passing of your mother. Sounds like she is in a better place. Good morning, everyone, and I see some very familiar faces out there. Here's some very familiar voices also on NXDN, and if you're not part of our NXDN family here in West Central Florida, maybe after today's presentation, you will be. We've got some very useful information to pass along with you. And I also have a bit of a surprise that has been afforded me by some folks that I know. So we will get to that in just a moment. Our subject today is NXDN amateur radio. And what's the significance of NXDN? What is it, first of all? Well, NXDN, and for some reason, Darrell is, there we go. There we go. What is NXDN? Well, the simple answer is it is a common air interface, or it's a protocol. Just like there's P25, just like there's Fusion and DMR and D-Star, NXDN is one of those digital flavors for two-way radio. It was created jointly in 2005 by two names that I'm sure you're very familiar with as hams, ICOM and Kenwood. It was a joint venture, and it was the outgrowth of something that occurred in December 2004. That is a report and order from the Federal Communications Commission that basically laid out a roadmap for what the FCC wanted to do with 25 kilohertz channels for land mobile radio. That's the section of stuff in the UHF band that's between 451 and 470, and in the VHF band between 150 and 174 megahertz. As we said, it is a common air interface. It is a defined protocol. The technical specifications are available on the NXDN Forum website. The NXDN Forum is a group of radio manufacturers, not just of radios, but of test equipment, of software, of the various things that make up NXDN. We have the emission designators, the type of modulation, frequency division, multiple access. It can have two flavors, very narrow band or ultra narrow band at 6.25 kilohertz, which is what we're focusing on. And then there's also a 12.5 kilohertz version of NXDN, which is used primarily by Kenwood in the Part 90 world for multi-site trunking. The signaling should be very familiar. It's 4 frequency shift key, FSK. And the data rates, 4,800 baud for 6.25 kilohertz and 9,600 baud for the 96 kilohertz. As we said, it was created by Kenwood and ICOM as a joint venture in 2005. And in response to that narrowbanding report and order, there are 3 modes for NXDN. There is conventional mode. There is a type C trunking, which is used primarily by Kenwood, and a type D trunking, which is used primarily by ICOM. I do not know the history of why the two companies decided to go separate directions, although the type D trunking is a lot like LTR radio, which was an analog distributed trunking version that preceded digital. Now, let's do a comparison. Analog. VHF and UHF, we have 25 kilohertz channels for amateur radio. Still, because we operate under Part 97, the folks in Part 90 have gone to 12.5 kilohertz. That happened 10 years ago. And there's still a lot of folks out there that are operating in analog mode. Analog uses PL tones or CTCSS to give you some modicum of privacy, but it is a one-size-fits-all. And that's where digital, and particularly NXDN digital, differentiates itself from analog. Yes, it is still an FM signal for FSK digital. It operates VHF and UHF, 6.25 kilohertz channels. RAN codes are the digital equivalent of a PL or a CTCSS, but it's different insofar as you do not transmit a continuous subaudible tone in digital. A RAN code is a couple of bytes of information that are contained in the header packet or the first packet that is part of a voice packet stream. And if you miss that RAN code and any other information in that header packet, and you've got your radio set for any type of squelch, well, your radio is not going to unsquelch. So that is a big differentiator between analog and digital. With digital, we can organize entities into talk groups. And even within the same entity, you can have multiple talk groups depending upon what it is that you are trying to do. We're going to talk more about this because we have done some evolving and some growing with our talk groups. In digital, individual calling is something that is quite easy to implement. So we have a room here of about 30 folks this morning. And if I wanted to speak with any one of you using NXDN individual calling, we could do it. And everyone else would just hear the sound of silence or my sound of blathering. And every radio, unlike analog, has a unique ID. Now, this is really important because it enables us to identify the radio, the person behind the radio very easily. And it's also important because you don't want to have two radios on the air at the same time with the same ID. Because if you do, and they're different people, they won't be able to talk with each other. It's kind of like two computers with the same IP address. Only in computer land, the second computer will knock the first one off the network. That's not quite the case here. You will still, if you're not one of those two people with that same ID, you'll still be able to hear those people, but they won't be able to communicate with themselves, either by voice or by digital messaging. So it is very important that when we program radios, and particularly a lot of them, that we make sure that everyone has a unique ID. Some other contrasts. In analog, we can do simplex communications and we can do repeater communications, all very common for amateur radio. In digital, we can do the same thing. Simplex communications is really easy in NXDN digital. And in fact, you program your radio almost the same way. NXDN works through repeaters. And one of the real benefits of digital, since you already have a stream of zeros and ones going through the repeater, it is very simple and relatively easy to link your repeaters together via a network. And that network could be almost anything. It could be the internet. It could be a private network, as long as you can plug a cable into an Ethernet port in the repeater and another Ethernet port over here into this repeater, you can link those repeaters together. And that gives you easily a much larger footprint. NXDN now has also evolved, and we haven't tried it yet in amateur radio, but with frequencies in some areas, at least here in Florida, being as difficult to get your hands on as they are, if we wanted to put up 2 or 3 or 5 or pick a number of repeaters on the same frequency pair, we can now engage in NXDN simulcast. That's where you're not only using the same receive frequency, but you're also using the same transmit frequency. It is a little more difficult than just turning the repeaters on and saying, have at it, because when repeaters overlap, they all have to be on the same time base. It's kind of like video. And being an animal who came out of the broadcast industry, if you try and connect 2 cameras or 2 video sources together and you don't want all kinds of weird things going on with your video, when you switch one to the other, they have to be on the same time base. Well, simulcast repeaters also have that effect. And they have that need because if you're in that overlap area between repeaters, you still want to be able to hear your audio or receive or transmit your messages. Hence, the repeaters need to be on the same time base. But it works, and it works very well. One of the other real strengths of NXDN is its ability to decode the zeros and ones at a very low RF level. How low? And what about coverage? Well, first of all, let's compare apples with apples. If you have an analog repeater with a ERP, an effective radiated power, and an antenna height, and the terrain is whatever it is, and then you put an NXDN repeater up with the same ERP or something that's very similar antenna height and gain, and terrain equivalency, NXDN, even at 6.25 kilohertz, will outperform a 25 kilohertz analog repeater by at least 15%. And we have demonstrated that numerous times over the last almost 20 years now, because NXDN has the ability to decode the voice information or the digital information at a much lower RF level than analog. How low? NXDN radios are designed to decode the stream down to minus 116 dBm. That is a very weak signal. Now, by comparison, the general noise floor out in the hinterland is generally considered somewhere around minus 128 dBm. So as you can see, this is not that much above the noise floor. And hence, if you've got a radio like this one or this one, and you put it next to an RF emitter like the screen, which does emit some radio noise, you actually can have noise floors in certain situations that are above where an NXDN radio can decode, and that can cause some interference. But if you were to take 2 radios, operate them in analog mode, and go to the extreme to where the audio is barely intelligible because it's so full of noise, snap, crackle, and pop, and then do a direct comparison and transmit NXDN, chances are that analog transmission is going to be something that you're going to be sitting there scratching your head going, what did that person say? On NXDN, it will be clear as a bell. It's that simple. So that's one of the real strengths of NXDN digital. It decodes the audio stream. It decodes the message stream down at a very low minimal RF level. That enables you to work in some buildings, that otherwise you would not be able to communicate in. It enables you to work out in other areas where you have natural obstructions like trees and flowers and chirping birds and other kinds of buildings. That is one of NXDN's real strengths. Share a little anecdote with you how well this works. Several years ago, after we put up the first NXDN repeaters, I happened to be on my way to Gainesville one Sunday afternoon in the middle of a thunderstorm. And as I'm approaching the Pasco-Hernando County line on Interstate 75, I got into a severe thunderstorm, actually declared by the National Weather Service. And I drove up the road at a very slow rate now because it's pouring rain, lots of lightning, wind, what have you. And we're starting to get enough water on the road that I don't want to hydroplane. Well, it's a good thing I was moving as slowly as I was, because at that time, in that particular part of Hernando County, we had a heavily wooded median area between the north and southbound lanes. Well, this thunderstorm generated a downburst that brought a tree down right across the left-hand lane. Boom. Hit that, you're not going to go anywhere. Well, I immediately got on the radio knowing that there would be somebody there that was supporting Skywarn, and I called it in because this was obviously going to require some public safety response. At least one lane was blocked. On analog, going into the Holiday repeater site, which is at the far southwestern corner of Pasco County, at 1,100 feet, I was barely readable because of terrain, because of weather conditions, what have you. But I knew, based on the party that came back to me, that that operator also had NXDN available, and there was an NXDN repeater on that tower. So I said, go to NXDN. I flipped the channel on my radio to an NXDN channel, and the two of us had a perfectly clear QSO. No problems reading him. He had no problems reading my transmission. That's one of the real powers of NXDN. Now, the West Central Florida group, of which some of you know I'm the president of and one of the founders, put our first repeater on the air 22 years ago yesterday. It was our 22nd anniversary that the first repeater at Verna went on the air. Since that time, the NI4CE analog system has built out and covers all of West Central Florida and then some. The West Central Florida group has also been a pioneer with digital radio here in the section. We put our first NXDN repeater on the air at what was then our Riverview site in 2007. Since, we have built out a much larger network. How large? Well, on your screen right now, you're looking at the sum total of the NI4CE NXDN repeaters plus one that was put on by another party, but as part of our NX Core NXDN network. You'll also note that there are 3 of those circles that are dashed. Those are repeaters that have yet to be put on the air, but we are planning to put those on the air this spring. One will be in Bartow, and the repeater literally will sit right next to our analog repeater at the Bartow site. Another will be at our Lake Placid site, where we've had an analog repeater for the last 5 years. NXDN will be joining them on 442.1125, assuming that our friends at FASMA coordinate that frequency for us. And there is a third repeater that is currently in the planning stages. We don't have even a frequency to look at yet, for the Cape Hayes Peninsula in Charlotte County. And that will supplement the NXDN repeater that is located near the Charlotte-Lee County line, just west of US 41. That covers southern and western Charlotte County. Actually, it covers a lot more than that. I had a QSO while I was going to Hamcation 2 weeks ago with a ham from Charlotte County. And to show you the reach of that repeater, he was in Brownsville, mobile, with a 5-watt radio and an antenna on his car. How many of you know where Brownsville is? Anybody? It's way outside Charlotte County. Brownsville is at the Hardy-DeSoto County line, about 20 miles north of Charlotte County. Now, I think he had some propagation enhancement, but we do know that the Charlotte County repeater goes from the Lee-Collier County line all the way up I-75. And if you get off there in Charlotte County and go up 17, well, on any given day, you will carry that repeater well north of Arcadia. So these are the repeaters. These are the frequencies that now make up the West Central Florida NXDN network. We're also adding some talk groups. And these talk groups are part of the growing experience, but also part of the learning experience from an event that occurred a few months ago. In addition to the Florida talk group, which will be a statewide talk group, we also have a West Central Florida section talk group. There will now be 4 tactical talk groups so that if we need them for emergency communications, they are there. And that will allow us to compartmentalize, if you will, emergency communications response in various parts of the West Central Florida section. And also being added is a Skywarn talk group. And yes, the National Weather Service office at Ruskin is now NXDN equipped. Yes, sir.
Oh, you might explain to them how the talk groups work. You might explain to them how the talk groups work.
Oh, okay. A talk group is simply a logical grouping of radios and of users. Talk group 1200, which we've called Florida, is designed to cover the entire state. So let's assume that there is a NXDN repeater in Jacksonville or Tallahassee or Miami or Fort Lauderdale, and you want to make contact with them. Talk group 1200 will go throughout the state. Talk group 1201 is designed to operate on the repeaters and for West Central Florida. So if you have that repeater in Jacksonville that you might be able to talk with on 1200, they'll have a completely different talk group to cover North Florida. If you want to speak with somebody here in West Central Florida and keep the communications compartmentalized to West Central Florida, you would use talk group 1201. In the event of an emergency, and we never have any of those here in West Central Florida, but in the event of an emergency, I see our new section emergency coordinator here going, yeah, we never have anything like that. Dream on, Bill. But bottom line is emergencies, and particularly large scale emergencies, and we never have any of those either, will take on a different set of needs, a different personality, depending upon where you are. If you're in Charlotte County, as an example, your emergency might involve a lot of traffic, might be multidimensional. Whereas if you're in Pinellas County, well, it may be a sunny day, maybe a little wind, but it may be a sunny day. And if you want to do some communications in Pinellas County, but you don't want to interfere with the folks in Charlotte County, well, we now have a mechanism to easily do that. And these tactical talk groups will be signed or assigned as the need arises. Now let's talk about needs. Before Hurricane Ian, in particular and Hurricane Nicole last fall, NXDN really hadn't had much of an event or much of a level of recognition as far as emergency communications. Ian in particular changed all that. People had needs in areas that analog repeaters did not cover or did not cover well. At the same time, people in Charlotte County were evacuated to shelters or they hunkered down if they stayed in Charlotte County. In the shelters, NXDN was used extensively. Because the shelters themselves were NXDN equipped and so were the hams. But NXDN was also used to get information into and out of the shelters to other parts of West Central Florida. And because NXDN works at that very low minimal RF level, and because we have been fortunate in building the NXDN network at places that have emergency power and connectivity, it worked. And it opened a lot of eyes. Yes, people have heard about digital amateur radio. Most people didn't know a lot about it. But when the dike breached in Sarasota County along the Hidden River that impacted about 70 homes with immediate and serious flooding, the folks in Sarasota County, who for the previous 3 or 4 days had been working feverishly with NXDN out in the field, were able to respond, and that signal went immediately to the Sarasota County EOC. The communications there was crisp, clear, easy to understand. Most importantly, the big E, effective. NXDN as an emergency communications tool in West Central Florida was on the map. Now, we did practice sort of a response to something like Ian last April. It was called Operation High and Dry 2. And thanks to a couple of friends who worked in their laboratory as the mad scientists they are, that's their description, not mine. We had a very effective, realistic emergency exercise, and NXDN was part of it. So the folks that worked High and Dry 2 already knew NXDN would work. Now they had to use it for real, and they did. With radios as small as this one, it worked. And because it worked, we're going to be using NXDN even more, and it has also led to the expansion of the NXDN network to make it easier for portable coverage everywhere in West Central Florida. I want to address this because people ask me about this all the time. Hotspots. Are there hotspots for NXDN? Yeah, there are. You can buy hotspots that are built on Raspberry Pis. There's some other hotspots that are out there that are built on different technology platforms. However, a hotspot at this point will not be found on the NXDN network here in West Central Florida. Why? Well, you can't take the hotspot away from a wire. So it's not mobile. It's not portable. And NXDN, despite how some people view this very effective digital mode, is radio. It's not voice over IP. Now, if you want to use a hotspot and you want to plug your hotspot up to the internet and you want to talk with somebody that, you know, maybe is in the next county, the next state, the next continent, fine, have at it. But we're not going to tie up repeater time and radio time with folks that aren't really into radio. This is amateur radio, not digital echo link. And that's effectively what hotspots are. They're just another form of echo link. And if you want to do that, fine, I have no problem. But we're not going to have a lot of hotspots that aren't using radio input to tie up a repeater network. Now, as we said, NXDN was created jointly by Kenwood and ICOM in 2005. This is not new technology. It's been around a while. It's been proven. In fact, both companies are now into their second generation radios and repeaters and some other tools that are used with NXDN. The Kenwood folks have second generation radios. They work quite well in conventional mode, and a number of people here in West Central Florida prefer Kenwood to ICOM, and that's fine as long as it works. And if a third company or a fourth company or a fifth company comes out with an NXDN radio that works in conventional mode at 6.25 kilohertz, all the better, because the more manufacturers that are out there, the more the competition. ICOM is also on its second generation radios. This is a second generation radio, as is this, the F4400, which some of you have. This radio, which is one of the originals, the F4161, is a first generation radio. Now, there are a couple of things, and we're going to talk about this later today with our advanced presentation on programming. The first generation radios did not have two very important characteristics or capabilities that the second generation radios have. And I say they're important particularly for amateur radio. One of them is called over-the-air alias. What does that mean? Well, in this radio, remember, every NXDN radio has to have a unique individual radio ID. Well, this radio has a table that you can fill out so that ID 1 is John, ID 1000 is Bill, ID 1002 is Sarah, or whatever the name. And so instead of seeing a number on your radio when you receive it, you'll see the name. But it's got to be programmed into the radio, otherwise all you'll see is their ID number. With this radio, which has OTAA, remember those four letters, over the air alias, you can program into a separate field in the programming what you want displayed on the radio. Now, for ham radio, that one's a no-brainer. You put your call sign in there, because after all, that's how we know each other, our call signs. So if I press push to talk, you're going to see NB9X. If Bill presses his push to talk radio, you're going to see N4NOA. Simple as that. And every time you do that, every time you press the push to talk button and you transmit your call sign, guess what? You have just met your legal requirements as far as the FCC is concerned for IDing. Pretty neat. One other thing that is part of these second generation radios, which is really important, is something called RX group. This is an ability that when you're on a frequency that you can receive multiple talk group traffic automatically. It's effectively similar to scanning without having to put your radio into scan. I'll tell you how we're playing it out. On the new programming profiles that we've put together for the ICOM radios with those talk groups you just saw on the screen, if you're in one of those tactical groups, let's say WCF1, you're busy doing your thing, but somebody from elsewhere in the section needs to call you, maybe on talk group 1200. Without having to do a thing, you will hear their transmission. That will then be your signal to change channels and go talk with them on talk group 1200, as opposed to talk group 1230 or 1232. It is a very effective tool. Now, I promised you a little surprise today. There is a brand new, and it's got amateur radio written all over it, a brand new mobile radio that ICOM will be introducing and turning loose on the world in about 3 weeks. Here it is. This is the brand new ICOM F6130 amateur radio priced mobile radio. It is effectively the companion radio to the F2100DS. 128 memory channels, a great white on black display. How many of you can see this? Isn't that fantastic? Great audio. In fact, how good is the audio? This is the audio from the F6130 Delta. Loud, crisp, clear. NB9X, because that was on an radio frequency. But you knew that because you saw my call sign come across on the screen. But just in case you didn't, I will have this here today. If you'd like more information on it, come see me after the presentation. We'll be set up down in the cafeteria area. When I said this has got amateur radio written all over it, a lot of people think that digital radio is uber expensive. You got to be Mr. Moneybags or Ms. or Mrs. Moneybags in order to afford a digital radio. You don't. This radio will likely be priced at under $400. Final price is to be determined in a couple of weeks, but that's the indication I've received from the manufacturer. You'll pay more than that for a lot of other analog only radios. So if you're interested in the F6130, come see me. We've also talked a lot about antennas, and we talk about these on Wednesday nights during our NXDN net, which is held every Wednesday night at 7:30. Antennas are important. Most amateur radio is vertically polarized. But what happens when that vertically polarized linear signal bounces off of a building or a piece of metal or plays ping pong across several buildings in a downtown area? You end up with signals that are going out of phase. And every time a signal bounces off of something, it changes phase 90 degrees. How do you combat that? Two ways. Either you put in a circular or elliptically polarized antenna at the repeater site, and there's only a couple of manufacturers out there that are producing those, but they are now, finally. Or you put in a multipolarized antenna on your radio. And what that does is it defeats the phasing issue and improves the bit error rate for your digital signal. We didn't know this at the time, but if you recall, I said a little while ago, we put our first NXDN repeater on the air in 2007. And one of the first things we did after that was on the air is the West Central Florida group, in conjunction with one of the largest television antenna manufacturers in the world, did a test of linear vertical versus circularly polarized antennas at the repeater site. What we found is that a CP antenna, which is commonly used, by the way, in commercial television broadcast since 1973, we found that a CP antenna will improve the bit error rate by 10 dB. That's huge. At the same time all of that was going on, the inventor of what I call the porcupine, or the MP antenna, which is pictured on your screen at the moment, was doing similar tests. And the results of their research, very similar. So if you have the CP antenna at the repeater origination site, fantastic. But if you don't, and most repeaters don't, that multipolarized antenna will effectively get you the same result. And I can't tell you the number of people who have put that antenna into place, and of all places, believe it or not, in attics, where RF signals like to bounce around a lot, and where you can get a lot of multipath and phase changing, and they get the job done. Yes.
Yeah, Paul, I want to say you presented this antenna last year, and I bought one, and I found it to be a superior antenna. Even for analog. I mean, people drive around with analog, you see your signal going up and down and stuff. Say it's flat, it's consistent, I hear the railroad tunnel, not lost the signal. In analog, not just digital, but analog. And if you're looking to get these antenna forms where I want to buy them. I remember checking it out on your vehicle, I remember you presenting it and stuff. And
Yep.
I totally endorse this antenna. I think it's a great antenna.
I'll tell you what, if you want a great test of it, just drive up Gun Highway here in Northwest Hillsborough County. The highway is canopied, lots of trees, and even on an analog signal, you will notice the difference between just a straight linear vertical antenna and the MP. It's
And
fantastic.
there's a side benefit too. I have a 5/8 width for 70 centimeters. This is a lot shorter, and I don't have to take it off when I go to the airport.
I was just going to say, that is a great benefit. You drive into any parking garage, but particularly the one over at TPA, and you don't have to take care of that linear. The thing fits very nicely. Thanks, Jim. All right, couple more quick things here before we get the cane here and yanks us off the screen. We use RAN squelch, which is a digital code. There's 64 of them, or selective squelch. And if you're going to get involved with talk groups or individual calling, you want to use selective squelch. We will have more on that this afternoon. We also talked about the OTAA, and if you're going to get into NXDN, and I really hope everybody does, register with radioid.net. They will issue you a published NXDN ID that will work not only here in Florida, but anywhere. One of the things that I have found with NXDN is it is audio that is tuned to the human ear. I find NXDN comms to be much easier to understand on these ears that have lots of years than any audio signal. The other neat thing with NXDN is it has noise cancellation. I could be driving down I-75 at 70 miles an hour, which in these days is a rarity. For those of you who haven't been on I-75 lately, you don't want to go because it's a parking lot all the way to Charlotte County. Yes, having done that for the last 3 weeks, I will agree with you. But the bottom line is, if you are fortunate enough to be able to drive at 70 miles an hour on our noisy Florida roads, the person on the other end with their NXDN radio probably won't even know you're mobile because of the noise canceling characteristics and processing that goes on in the NXDN radio. There's no snap, crackle, pop. And what's really nice is that the background noise that you're going to have with analog, for the most part, goes away. So those are my words of wisdom this morning. I hope you have found this presentation to be useful. I will tell you that of all of the modes out there, and my friends at ICOM may disagree with me, as much as I love D-Star, NXDN leaves D-Star in the dust. It is much easier to network. The equipment is readily available, albeit you're not going to buy it at a quote unquote ham radio store for reasons I'm not going to get into. You'll buy NXDN from a LAN mobile radio dealer because that's the kind of product it is. But the bottom line is, it is there, it works, and I, for one, believe it is the future of amateur radio, VHF, and UHF communications. Thank you very much. Anybody questions? Yes. I'm sorry. Kenwood does have a radio that does DMR, P25, and NXDN. ICOM has not gotten into that, and the indications I've heard from the people I know at ICOM is they're not going to get into it. They don't do DMR at all. They do P25, but so far, no NXDN P25.
Any SDR radios?
Not that I am aware of.
Is it an open source protocol? Is it an open source protocol?
It is the published protocol, let's put it that way. It is published, it's readily available.
Technically, it couldn't even be notified.
And I will tell you that the NX Core product that we use to link all of the NI4CE NXDN repeaters is open source. And in fact, one of our section ECs, Tom Chance, K9XV, has spent the last several months in his laboratory making some significant improvements to the NX Core product. And that is now currently online on the NI4CE NXDN system. Yes, Bill?
Is there any way to access the system without an ID?
No,
Okay, so you're gonna have to get that ID.
you're going to have to get that ID.
It's not a hard process.
No,
I had one for DMR for years, but NXDN was very easy.
Yep.
And I had an old ID on DMR of 1112047. That tells you how old it is. It's ancient from 2015, but I went on there. It's very simple. And I got a shall we say a permanent long radio was programmed up for me, and I was on NXDN.
Very good. Darrell, thank you for inviting me to do this presentation. I will be around and about, and we'll be back here at 2:30 this afternoon with some programming tips and what have you. So come see us. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to go ahead and end the recording, and then we'll leave the Zoom on. And we'll be back at 10 o'clock with our next presentation on overview